as a member of the European Association of Jewish Study to have a pleasure to talk to one of the greatest professors studying Jewish, among the others, in Shanghai, Prof. Lazin, who is Professor Emeritus at Ben Gurion University. He has written several books and many articles concerning politics and Jewish studies. So I have a great pleasure to listen to Professor's speech on GDC and European refugees in post-war Shanghai. So the floor is yours, Professor.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I'd like to say I'm a member of the European Association of Israel Studies. I've been to several conferences. I really find them to be challenging experiences where I learn a lot, as much as I also hopefully I contribute a great deal. But I'm also honored to be associated with your university in Poland. I've visited Poland several times. I've always enjoyed the visits. Never been to your university, but the name of your university goes before itself in the sense that people around the world in academia are aware of its history and its academic contributions. Now, I'd like to speak tonight about JDC, or the American Joint Jewish Distribution Committee, their role in aiding the refugees in Shanghai. They began in 1938, but I'm going to be focusing on the period after World War II, 1945 through 1948. Okay, let's start with the first slide. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the post-war American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. It was established in the United States during World War I. At the start of World War I, the idea that the American Jewish community would provide funding and assistance for those Jews in trouble, in particular in Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, the Ukraine, etc. So they set up this organization, which was funded by federations, Jewish federations around the country. I'm going to talk about this organization after World War II, where they helped the Jewish refugees from Europe in Shanghai. I'm going to focus on the first two directors, Manny Siegel, who fled from a Japanese prison camp in August of 1945, took over until the beginning of 46, later followed by Charles Jordan, who served until April of 1948. This talk presents the events from the perspective of the Joint Distribution Committee, since it's based on research in their files, looking at all the documents from that period. It does not necessarily reflect the perspective of the refugees themselves. The idea is that this type of research will add to many of the refugee accounts which were published ever since the late 1940s. In addition to looking at the documents in the archives of the JDC, I made extensive use of secondary sources, including some of the memoirs. Next slide. Now, what's the significance of Shanghai? It's a unique story related to the annals of the Holocaust, in which almost 18 to 20,000 European Jews that fled Hitler found sanctuary in Shanghai, China. Now, what's important to emphasize is that until June of 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, most Jews living in Germany and Austria at the time could leave the Third Reich. This, of course, I base this on the evidence provided by the works of Timothy Snyder. And if we look for an example at Eichmann when he was in Prague, and he dealt with the Jewish Council of Prague, and he demanded lists of the Jews, the purpose of these lists were not to send people to death camps, etc., but to get them to leave the country. That was the policy of the Third Reich until June of 1941. The main problem for most German, Austrian Jews, and later other Jews, there was no place to go. We can take a look at the Evian conference called by Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, in July of 1938. A representative of 30, 40, 50 nations came to Evian. They all sat down to deal with the issue, what can we do about Jewish refugees? Who's going to absorb them? And no country, perhaps with the exception of one, was willing to take in anyone. The other case to look at, of course, is the United States of America. It had a German quota, people born in Germany, of almost 25,000. With the exception of 1 year, the quota was never filled while Hitler was in power. That had to do with policies of consuls and also the general American policy. We don't want refugees. We don't want Jewish refugees, which was a sad commentary on the period. If you look in contrast to Shanghai, Shanghai was an open port. Again, this has to do with the colonial period, going back to the Opium Wars of the 1840s, where the Chinese turned 5 ports into open ports where colonial powers could live under the colonial powers who had representatives there. They could live under their own law. They weren't subject to Chinese law. What existed in Shanghai in 1938, 39, 40 was there was no Chinese sovereignty over the city. You had this extraterritoriality. That meant that foreigners were ruled by their own laws. The city had an international settlement, which was where the British, the Japanese, and the Americans had their own community. There was also a French concession, and the Japanese were there as well. And then there was the Chinese part of the city. But what's important to remember that after 1937, the Japanese drove the Chinese out. So basically you had a city in which there was no Chinese sovereignty. Result being that anyone that showed up could just come into the city. They didn't need a passport. They didn't need a visa. They needed no documents whatsoever. Next slide. Now, the European refugees who came from Europe, most came after 1938. Some came beginning in 1933. They came to China. They came to Shanghai. But around 1938, you had the Anschluss, Hitler taking Austria, the invasion of Czechoslovakia, and the Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass, the pogroms of November 9th and 10th, 1938. That was sort of the symbol. It represented sort of the end of German Jewry. Many people that thought of leaving decided now was the time to leave. And you also had the Chinese consul. He's often mentioned, Feng Shanho. The consul general in Vienna was giving a lot of people visas, but most of the refugees came beginning in 1938. And they were allowed to come in freely until late 1939, when the city authorities, meaning the British, the Americans, and the Japanese, started limiting entry only to relatives. However, reality mattered. Once Italy entered, how did most people come to Shanghai? They came by boat. So once Italy entered the war in June of 1940, that ended free travel in the Mediterranean, which basically meant no one is going to come to Shanghai by way of boats. The other way of coming was by the Trans-Siberian route. And this lasted until June of 1941. I would mention, a representative of JDC worked out an agreement with the Soviets to allow people to use the Trans-Siberian Railroad in exchange for X number of dollars. People paid money. So thousands of people, not tens of thousands, went across on the Trans-Siberian route. Usually some went, once they got all the way across to the Pacific, some came down to Shanghai, some came to Harbin. Most of them went by boat to Japan. In 1941, the Japanese took about 1,000 Polish, Lithuanian, Jewish refugees, shipped them from Kobe, Japan, to Shanghai. Many of these people had actually come by way of Kovno at one time, where you had the Japanese consul Sugihara that issued these people visas. A very important person at that time. So you had these about 1,000 Polish Jews. Many of them were members of the Mir Yeshiva, but there were also other socialists, etc., coming in 1941. All in all, there were about 18,000 Jewish European refugees in Shanghai by 1941. At the end of the war, there were about 15,000. Some had managed to leave even during the war to go to other places. Some people died natural deaths. The Japanese may have killed one person. Of course, there was some disease and other things that killed others. But at the end of the war, there were about 15 or 16,000. Next slide. Now, what's interesting is there were two local Jewish communities in Shanghai, the Baghdadi or Sfaradim, under 1,000. They came following the Opium Wars of 1840, the treaties. They were mostly Baghdadi Jews. Some had come by way of England. Again, they followed the British Empire. The British had access to Shanghai under the treaties from the Opium Wars in the 1840s. So many of the three of the most prominent families were the Sassoon, Kadoris, and the Haduns. Many of them were active in the opium trade. They then went into commerce, other types of commerce, banking, and especially real estate. Much of the Bund, a percentage of the buildings of the Bund in Shanghai, these wonderful Art Deco buildings that are still there. They provide the background for a famous Steven Spielberg movie. But many of the buildings on the Bund were built by these Iraqi Jews. The most famous hotel, today it's called the Peace Hotel, was built by the Sassoon family. However, many of the Iraqi Jews were middle class and even poor. Many of them were employed by the more wealthier Jews in their enterprises. They tended to marry within the families, etc., but they were the minority. The other group were the Russian Jews, about 6,000 to 8,000. Many of them came after the Soviet Revolution. They fled the revolution. Others had come when the building of the Trans-Siberian Railroad and other railroads in China. Many of the Russian Jews originally settled in Harbin. Once the Japanese went into Manchuria, there was a rise of anti-Semitism by the white Russians, the non-Jews that had fled from the Soviet Union. That were in Harbin. There was a lot of anti-Semitism, so many of these people moved to Shanghai. They were merchants, middle class, a lot of doctors, lawyers, that type, and there were also some poor working class Russian Jews. Now, the Sfaradim, the wealthy Sfaradim, set up a committee for the assistance of European Jewish refugees. It was known as the Spielman Committee. They provided food, shelter, housing, clothing. They helped absorb these people when they first came in. In 1938, they were set up in 38. They approached the American Joint Distribution Committee. I refer to it as JDC. JDC started funding. They provided most of the funding of the Spielman Committee to aid in the settlement and the upkeep of these European Jews. JDC sent over two directors, two people, Laura Margolis, a woman, which was an exception in those days, and someone named Manny Siegel. What they did was they saw the Japanese, the war was about to start, the war broke out, and they realized that they wouldn't be able to get money from the United States. So what Laura and Manny did, they secured loans. The Japanese allowed it. Why did the Japanese allow it? The Japanese wanted these refugees to be taken care of. They didn't want to have to take care of the refugees. So Laura and Manny got loans, which were guaranteed by JDC. The first loan was guaranteed by JDC. The second loan, they guaranteed in the name of JDC, but provided funding for the committees, these activities. They provided, the loans provided sufficient funding for the welfare of the European refugees to continue during the Japanese occupation until 1944, when JDC again started sending in money by way of Switzerland. Now, the important date here during the war is May of 43. The Japanese set up in the Hongqiu neighborhood a designated area. It was surrounded by barbed wire, and they forced the Jews from the the refugees that came after 37, that were living in the international settlement and in the French concession. These were better off refugees. They had to move into the designated area. You couldn't leave the designated area without a pass. The debate is it really a ghetto? Because if you think of a ghetto during World War II, one thinks of Poland, for an example. We had the Warsaw Ghetto, almost 450,000 people. Everyone dies. Everyone is deported to a German death camp. People die of disease. People are shot. People are tortured. That didn't take place in Shanghai. One has to keep that in mind. We'll come back to that afterwards. Next slide, please. Now, in 1944, as I mentioned, JDC resumes sending in money. The war ends in August of 45. At the end of the war, there were about 11,000 Jewish European refugees that are being aided by JDC. There are another couple of thousand that are taking care of themselves, living on their own, want nothing at all to do with JDC. They have their own money, they want to leave or they want to stay, they do whatever they want to do. What's interesting about the refugees that are being taken care of, 15% are non-Jewish. Who are they? They're Catholics, they're Protestants, they're free thinkers. Some are married to Jews, some are children of mixed married couples, but they live in JDC housing and they get the same aid as everyone else. Their kids go to the same refugee schools with the Jewish kids. Now, the Chinese national government, Chiang Kai-shek, takes over all of Shanghai. Now, the Allies in 1943 had a treaty where they ended extraterritoriality. Under extraterritoriality, if you're a British citizen in Shanghai, you break a law, you're tried by a British judge in a British court in Shanghai. The same for the Americans, the same for the Japanese, the same for the Germans. All of that ended in 43. Chiang Kai-shek takes over, but the American army also comes to the city, which is an interesting factor. And then in 1945, Siegel, who was the director before the war for the JDC, flees or is released from a Japanese prison camp. He comes back to Shanghai and he takes over and he works with the various Jewish relief committees for the refugees that are being funded by JDC. He thought the committees were corrupt and incompetent, but they worked together. And one thing that was interesting, about 1,500 of the refugees get jobs with the US Army, which helps them economically tremendously. I refer here to Kimberly Cheng's research. The Chinese resented the American occupation, that the Americans were there. They wanted all foreigners to leave. The Jewish refugees saw the American army as saviors, liberators, etc., which is an interesting comment. Okay, next slide. Now, Siegel's in charge. Now, he's going to cooperate, and this is interesting. The United Nations showed up. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. The CNRRA is the Chinese Relief and Rehabilitation Administration that worked with UNRWA. Now, UNRWA was set up, they gave China, the United Nations, really the United States, close to $500 million, a lot of money in those days, 500 million, to deal with refugees, not European refugees in particular, but including them, but mainly Chinese refugees. They wanted to rebuild these countries. They wanted to repatriate refugees that weren't in their homelands, etc. So under UNRWA and the CNRA, there was a provision of tremendous amounts of food, bedding, and clothing. On UNRWA relief in 1947, in July of 47, were almost 8,000 Jewish refugees in the city. So one should keep in mind that the United Nations provided JDC and the refugees with a lot of resources. Now, what Siegel did was, which was interesting, JDC during the war ran these soup kitchens. He ended the soup kitchens, and instead he had a program of financial assistance. Refugees wanted to be independent. They wanted to buy their own food. They wanted to cook themselves. So the whole situation, the approach changed, although they kept the committees. But they also had a lot of relief. And the relief, if you look at these numbers, in October of 45, 10,571 people got JDC relief in the city. There were only about 11,000 people that they dealt with. Almost everyone got relief. You'll notice that over the years in February of 48, there were only 3,500 on relief. That doesn't mean people are prospering. That means people are leaving. The numbers are decreasing, but a large number, the majority of refugees that remained were poor, were on welfare. They got food aid from the United Nations, etc. Next slide. Now, Siegel suffered a lot in the Japanese camp. He had various types of dysentery, etc. He got tired. He probably, it was near a breakdown. He said, replace me. So he's out after 3 or 4 months, and he's going to be replaced by Charles Jordan. Now, what's interesting to me is, and this is something I'm not going to go into, but which is interesting, JDC had people in the United Nations agencies, in UNRRA. For an example, there's Gertrude Van Tian. I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. She was a German Jew who was in Holland during the German occupation. And she was in charge of the major Jewish relief organization during the German occupation. She had to deal a lot with the Germans. Professor Wasserstein wrote a fantastic book called The Ambiguity of Virtue. It's all about Gertrude. But all of a sudden, she shows up after the war. She's working with UNRWA and the CNRRA. She's the liaison for the European refugees. There's someone else named Beckelman. Beckelman ran JDC in Lithuania when the Germans showed up. He fled. He's the one that set up the agreement with the Soviet Union on the Trans-Siberian Railroad. He has a senior position with an organization called the Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees. That was set up in Evian in 38. It was still around in 47. They send him to Shanghai to write up, to do a report on the status of European refugees. So JDC had a lot of good connections inside these refugee agencies. Next slide. Now, the Chinese government came out with an edict on November 27th, 1945. Most people weren't aware of it until the middle of December. But basically what they did was they said all Germans have to be repatriated. How do you translate that? Is any German in Shanghai after the war has to leave the country. Who did that include? It included the Jewish refugees. In other words, the Chinese did not make a distinction between Nazis, Germans that weren't Nazis. There were Christians and German Jewish refugees. They wanted everyone out of the country. Siegel said this was a shock, forced reparations. We're not able to remain here, but the handwriting was on the wall and it became clear to everyone. The Chinese government, not the communists, the nationalists want everyone to leave. How do you understand this? Put it in the context of colonialism. They had been controlled by colonial powers for hundreds of years, including the Japanese that raped their country, that occupied their country. They want everyone to leave, including the Jewish refugees. So this was a problem, and this was the handwriting on the wall that they want them to leave. I'll come back to this later on. Let's go on to the next slide. Now, Jordan arrives at the end of 45. Takes over in January of 46. he immediately reports the government isn't forcing us out. In other words, they're not sending us away. They're not really implementing, but that's the policy. So Jordan continuously, with municipal authorities, goes to them and talks to them and says, we're getting people out. We're going to get everyone, we're organizing to get them out of the country. Everyone will eventually leave. Now, Jordan appreciated very much the United Nations aid, the food. For an example, they provided people with bulk food, milk, flour, sugar, and things like that. All the flour allowance was given to JDC, to the relief agency. And what did they do with it? They baked bread for every single refugee. The cost of that was about $45,000 a month. JDC is only sending in $130,000. If you had to take $45,000 out just for bread, that's being provided by the United Nations. The other thing is, when they provided rations, they call it in bulk, they had these cans. They were called 10-in-1 rations. They had cookies, and they had cake, and they had chocolate. I don't know if they had cigarettes or not. I can't give you on that, but a lot of the stuff was sold on the black market. They were considered luxury goods beside the basic stuff. So that was tremendously helpful for the refugee community. It helped people survive. Now, supposedly, the United Nations was supposed to provide health, medicine. They didn't do a lot of it, but for example, everyone was vaccinated, free. Care of the United Nations to take care of things like disease. What was clear, and I mentioned this in another talk, I'm not going to really go into this, whatever the United Nations did for European refugees was much more than they did for the million or so Chinese refugees in Shanghai. The JDC was surprised, and some of the JDC people that worked for the UN were surprised that the UN had a double standard. You have to treat Europeans differently. The Jewish refugees benefited from this. The Chinese, of course, did not. Next slide. Now, Jordan, what he did was he got rid of all the committees and he took over. And again, they started sending in $130,000 a month from JDC to support the refugee community. There's a couple named Grodsky that come from Massachusetts. She's a social worker. So they set up a community center where they have youth programs, sports programs, educational programs, social events for youth, for adults, for everyone. They set up an organization. There's an organization called ORT, which was founded in Europe, where they provide job training for people. They have a library. They set up university courses. They had an Asian and an American seminar. People learned English. And they subsidized schools. There were these private schools for refugee children. JDC is subsidizing all of that. They had a hospital with 137 beds, which they operated. The CNRRA, that's the relief agency of the Chinese government with UN money, they provided 25 Quonset huts. These are huts with special types of tin roofs, which provided more housing, more hospital space, and other things like that. They also bought a complex of a couple of buildings where they set up an old age home for people that couldn't take care of themselves and things like that, etc. So this is some of the activities of JDC. Next. Now, housing was very important. Now, what's interesting about housing, they had what they called Heime, or camps. This began during the war. There were 7 camps. But after the war, they started moving people out of the camps into what they call lane housing. This is the type of housing which existed all over Shanghai. Now, a lane house were these like row houses where you had a gate on each side and individual houses like in blocks. But now a house could have 2 bedrooms. You'd have 2 families and maybe a 3rd family living in the living room. Many of these lane houses had no toilet facilities. They had a bucket. Buckets were collected every day. That was normal life for many of these people. Later on, some other housing was built that they did have toilets, but that was the minority. So in 46, you had 3,000 people living in 7 camps with another 500 people in 31 lane houses. By July of 47, you only have 1,200 people in camps and 1,600 people living in lane houses. So people are moving into lane houses, some people are leaving. And understand, some people don't live in either place, but they go back to live in the international part of the city or into the French concession. Now, one of the reasons why they also left the Heimer, the camps, the city wanted the camps back. They were converted schools, converted factories, converted housing. Next slide. Now, one thing that happened, there was a major protest by Chinese, probably organized by the city, at the Ward Road 772 Heimer or camp. The refugees claimed some of the housing had belonged to them. It was their housing, Chinese refugees. And who's living there now? Jewish refugees. What had happened was the Japanese forced them out in 37, 38. Jews somehow came back, got that housing later on. So they demanded the return of the housing. They set up, they had anti-Semitic banners, which the Chinese don't like to mention this, but where do they get? The Chinese aren't anti-Semitic. And that's a major point that is often made, but these anti-Semitic banners, they could have come on out of Nazi Germany, were hung all over the place. But it might have been organized by the city. In the end, there was a compromise. JDC promised all these Jews are going to leave, the housing will eventually be returned, etc. Okay, so let's just move on from there. Now, what Jordan did was he set up a new agency, a new department called Emigration. He wanted to foster and help people to leave. So he coordinated for the refugees. He helped them fill out the applications, dealt with the consuls and dealt with their relatives. Sometimes people had to sign documents and things like that. Dealt with the UN that was handling repatriation, dealt with the International Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees that was resettling stateless people, with the exception of the United States. So they were doing all of that. Jordan did a survey and found where do people want to go? 39% wanted to go to the United States, 20% to Australia, that's almost 60% of the people, 16% wanted to be repatriated, 8% Palestine, low Palestine, Israel. Okay, next slide. Now, JDC, I'm going to skip over this just very briefly. JDC covered people's passage, paid for the boat if they couldn't afford it. There were various arrangements to get the money back. That was a disaster for JDC. The consul in the beginning, US consul, most people wanted to go to America, only opened in March of 46, started issuing visas. They were issuing 2 a day. Most were given to the ultra-Orthodox from the Mirror Yeshiva. They had what was known as protectia. They had good connections. But one of the problems with leaving Shanghai, there weren't ships to Europe, there weren't ships to Australia, there weren't ships to America. Most of the ships were taking soldiers home from the war, etc. And then the issue of repatriation came up. JDC in Vienna that handled migration, they didn't want JDC to repatriate anyone. They also didn't want Jews coming back to Vienna. They said it's a mess after the war, all these DPs coming in, the same with Germany. But Levitt of JDC in New York overruled them and said, if people want to repatriate, we'll repatriate them. Next slide. Now, Jordan went to the American embassy and said, look, we'll coordinate. Instead of refugees just showing up, filling out applications, protesting, etc., we'll coordinate when people should come in for interviews and other things like that. We'll provide the documentation. We'll provide translators to the American embassy. And then Jordan opposed the priority that was given to the rabbis and the religious Jews, etc. Now, by October of 46, things pick up. There was the Truman directive. Now, this is something interesting. President Truman, after the war, said, we have to do something for the refugees. So we wanted priority given to German refugees, okay, but within the quotas. He didn't want the quotas touched. In other words, we're not going to increase immigration just according to the quotas. But he allowed for something called corporate affidavits. Any refugee coming into the United States had to have someone sign an affidavit that they wouldn't become a public charge. That was a long process. So instead of doing individual affidavits, they allowed for a corporate affidavit. JDC could vouch for someone instead of a relative. So that speeded up the process. So for an example, in December of 46, 864 visas were issued, which means a lot of visas are being issued. By February of 47, 2,500 would have left already for America. So the American visas are picking up, but keep in mind, these are visas primarily for Germany, which had a large quota, up to 25,000. Although you had plenty of people in Europe that wanted to use those numbers, Shanghai had to compete with them. Next slide. The Australians sent over, that was the place of second choice. So they're going to send over someone to look at Shanghai. What's interesting is the Jewish community, the organized Jewish community in Sydney, sends a letter to JDC in Shanghai and says the following: when refugees come from Shanghai to Australia, make sure they do the following: that they don't give any interviews to the press, they don't tell anyone that they're Jewish, and they don't tell anyone that they're displaced persons. Okay, that was the message that Jordan got, Jordan, the head of JDC. Maisel, another representative of the Jewish community, also representing Arthur Caldwell, the Minister of Immigration in Australia, he comes to look over the situation in Shanghai. But he emphasizes, I'm looking at Jewish refugees and non-Jewish refugees, meaning the white Russians. He favored Poles over Germans. He made a comment, he doesn't like Germans. Now, he's talking mainly about Jews. He thinks Polish Jews are better material for Australia than German Jews. Jordan thought they'd get a lot of numbers. He interviewed a lot of people, thought about thousands. However, right about that time, Australia introduced a policy that any ship bringing in refugees could not contain more than 25% Jews. In other words, Jews could only be 25%. The same with any plane coming in, bringing in refugees. You could have a maximum of 25% of the people could be Jewish. Now, what's the significance of this? The significance of this is, if JDC wanted to charter a boat or a plane bringing in Jewish refugees who had visas for Australia, they couldn't do it because it would be 100% Jewish. So that, in other words, the Australians made it difficult for those people that eventually got landing permits or visas to even come into the country. And they had a policy of, we don't want Jews. Okay, next slide. Now, the IRO, the United Nations reformed all the various refugee groups and set up the International Refugee Organization in June and July of 47. They operated in China from July 1st, 47. They took over for UNRWA and the Intergovernmental Committee. So they funded resettlement and repatriation. What it basically meant is anyone JDC was repatriating or helping to resettle any place, the IRO paid at least minimum of $300 to $500, which basically covered the ticket. So by December of 47, JDC already expects about 1,500 people will be going to the United States, if not more. Now, what was the main problem? The problem was refugees in Shanghai, Jewish refugees that wanted to go to the United States, but they were born in countries with low quotas. They were born in Poland, in Austria, Romania, Czechoslovakia. So for an example, in a particular time, probably around 47, there were 3,600 on German quotas. They were in good shape. 1,622 Austrian. They were in trouble. The same with the 2,000 Poles. Now, what complicated matters even more, if you looked at the German quota, there was 656 women and children to men on other quotas. In other words, the husband in the family didn't have a German, couldn't come in under the German quota, which meant he probably couldn't get a visa to the United States, which meant the family didn't leave because they didn't want to split up. So that became the issue. So there's an association of small quota committee, people from these countries, and they basically said that the point was, we have 3,500 people in Shanghai, we're trapped, we can't get to America. Next slide. Now, Jordan decides at the end of 47, replace me, I want to leave. And he says basically, everything is going to change now in Shanghai in 48. We're going to go down to about 5,000 people. We're going to have to cut back on services. There are a lot of more and more of the refugees that remain tend to be the elderly, people from countries with lower quotas. There are a lot of sick people as well. And they already cut back because of the reduced numbers. JDC is only providing $100,000 a month. Okay, let's go on. Now, in mid-47, he submits a report. Again, he's talking about almost half of left. He's talking about maybe about 6,500, although it's probably even fewer, will be left. Hopes to resettle about 5,000 between the United States and Australia, also to repatriate people. And if you notice, more people are being repatriated to Austria than to Germany, even though there are 3 or 4 times as many Germans as Austrians. That's because of the American quota. Germans can get into America, Austrians can't. Camp is down to about 800 people. 1,600 living in the lanes. They hired someone named Glasgow in February of 48 to replace Jordan. And again, you can see here the German quota. There was a problem with the 2,300 on the German quota. 750 people were too old or too sick to go into the United States. They were doubtful about any American legislation that's going to help. And Europe tends to have priority in terms of the United States. In other words, the United States seems to be making much more of an effort to get rid of DPs in Europe, to bring them into the United States than to deal with the people in Shanghai. But the one issue which bothered a lot of people was the fact the communists are coming. Shanghai is under siege by communist forces. What's going to happen? Next slide. So Glasgow comes in March of 48. Jordan leaves and he files a final report. There's really nothing here of significant in the report, but what he basically suggests in the report, as the numbers get less and less, we can provide fewer and fewer services. That's going to be a problem. And eventually JDC will probably have to withdraw. And he suggests that Glasgow, the new director, work with the Ashkenazi community, let them take over for JDC, with JDC still providing some of the money, but let them care for the older population, refugee population that's going to remain, for the sick and the infirm, for those that can't get out. But he felt that everyone eventually is going to have to leave. Okay, let's move on. Now, what are the conclusions, basically, and what's going to happen afterwards? One of the interesting issues that is raised in the research, did everyone have to leave? What was the expectation? Was that determined from day one after the war? So some of the people that have done research on Shanghai, Restaino, an American scholar, made the comment that all the refugees wanted to leave. Unlike the Baghdadian Russians, they were in a waiting hall. They came to Shanghai because it was temporary. They knew eventually they're going to have to go someplace else, or they wanted to go someplace else, like to America. Gelderman, in contrast, in an article in 1999, concluded, at first, right after the war, many of the refugees wanted to stay. They were tired, some of them were old. Europe symbolized the death of their families. Who wanted to go back to Europe? Why should we start all over again in another new place? Now, my study found that there was no evidence, it found no evidence for one way or the other. In other words, in the JDC files, there's no proof to say someone did a study, everyone wants to leave or everyone wants to stay, etc. But what was interesting to me was, in April of '46, Jordan writes in a letter, when I arrived a month ago, and then Beckelman came from an international organization. He used to work for JDC. When we both came to Shanghai, we came under the impression that we're going to integrate all of these refugees into China. I just thought that was interesting. In other words, he thought, why is he coming to head JDC? We're going to integrate these people. They're only about 20,000. It's a big city. It's a big country. They can find a place here. Next slide. Now, there's the interesting issue of the Chinese Civil War. What a lot of people do, Restaino, why do they argue that most people wanted to leave, or at least shortly after the war? They refer to two issues. One, the Civil War. There was literally a civil war taking place between the nationalists and the communists, and then the economic crisis. Unbelievable inflation. It's like Germany and Weimar with the wheelbarrows carrying money and things like that. A pack of cigarettes cost a million CNC, Chinese dollars at one time. So she's saying, Restaino, everyone comes to the conclusion, everyone wanted to leave. The Russians, the Baghdadis, and the refugees. Now, one of the things that's interesting to me is, if you look at the JDC files, and you look at everything that was written from Shanghai and everything that was written from New York and from Europe about the situation in Shanghai, no one mentions the Civil War, virtually never mentioned until 1948. So in 46 and 47, when people start leaving, no one's mentioning the Civil War. But what's evident? Chiang Kai-shek and his policies. In other words, it's the nationalist government. That decree that I mentioned, we want all Germans to leave. That was the handwriting on the wall that made it clear to everyone, we're not wanted in China. We have to leave. It wasn't the Civil War. Okay, next slide. Now, some other findings. One of the things that's interesting, I'll go through this quickly and then I'll finish. Most refugees wanted the United States, but the United States didn't want them. It's ironic, but the quota system that kept refugees out in the 1930s kept many of them out after World War II. Nothing had changed. Despite the Holocaust, despite, we learned our lesson, no one wanted the Jews, they didn't want them after the war. The one thing that's interesting in the JDC files, in contrast to the 1930s, is everyone that worked with the American consuls in Shanghai from JDC thought the consuls were wonderful. They weren't the problem. The problem were laws in the United States, the policies of the United States government. Point number two, Australia, the same policy. The government didn't want Jews. They wanted, since I gather we'll have a lot of Polish visitors, they wanted they wanted Poles, but they wanted Christian Poles. And there were plenty of Christian Poles in Germany after World War II, let them come. And there were white Russians in Shanghai, let them come. Jews, we don't want. and they had restrictions, they had quotas. They can't, when Jewish refugees had visas for Australia and they were stranded in Hong Kong, they got them out of Shanghai, they got them to Hong Kong, and a boat was on the way. Australia ordered the boat back. We need to bring home soldiers. Can't use it to bring in Jewish refugees. Now, third point, an amazing thing to keep in mind, the UNRWA, the United Nations aid for the refugees, was crucial for JDC. It allowed them to fund to handle the immigration, to provide food and other things. The point that I make is this: without the United Nations aid, JDC couldn't have handled it. It wouldn't have worked. And that's something to keep in mind. In other words, they didn't have the resources. They didn't have the money. United Nations made it all possible. Sometimes the Israelis like to get, they emphasize the fact the UN is always against us, etc. But in this case, the UN played a central role in helping Jewish refugees to survive. Now, finally, the final point here is with Jordan. He came to realize that we're being left in Shanghai with a hard core. As time goes by, a higher percentage of the refugees become infirm, TB cases, elderly, and especially the elderly, that no one wants. So he thought, he tried, but he didn't succeed. It didn't work out as well. He thought that maybe Germany would repatriate some of these infirm and sick to institutions in Germany and Austria. He also thought some American Jewish groups would take some of the elderly that were less worse off. That really didn't work out. So eventually the idea becomes, let the Ashkenazi community take over. What's going to happen, and we're not going to deal with it in this talk, eventually in late 48, when the numbers become even less, but everyone wants to leave, and you have all these infirm, there's a deal made with Israel. Israel initially wouldn't take the sick elderly, but eventually the United Nations agrees to provide funding. IRO is going to provide funding to Israel to deal with the handicapped, the sick, etc. And they're going to set up, JDC is going to set up an institution called Malben in Israel, and that's where all these people will go. Plus, anyone who couldn't get into other countries, once the communists arrived and people want to leave, although the communists treated them well, didn't harass them or do anything, but they wanted to leave, they all went to Israel. Whoever was left, Israel took them. But that's another story. Okay, let's go to, I think, the final slide. Unanswered questions. These are things for the future, which other scholars might want to look at. How much aid did the Baghdadis really provide to the original European refugees? There's a question, I'm going to skip over this Spielman committee. Laura Margolis had a lot of criticism of the Spielman committee. A lot of people are right about Ellis Chaim. He was one of the Baghdadis. He was number 2 in the committee. They tend to, a lot of their families write memoirs, and they write about their parents who were wonderful people and all their charity and all of that, but it's jaded in a positive sense. There has to be more research done on the committee and these people and what they did and what they didn't do. Too much of it is romanticized. And the final point is, there's a whole issue of, when I talked about the ghetto during 43, which I really don't deal with in this talk, there's the issue of the extent of the Nazi or Gestapo influence over the Japanese policy towards Jewish refugees. I happen to think, but it's only a thought, it's not proven, it's exaggerated. But scholars have to look into that in much more detail. I hope the talk was informative. Thank you.
Professor Lazin, thank you so much for this interesting introduction and explanation about the situation in Shanghai in very difficult times. I have a few questions concerning your talk. First of all, you mentioned that Joint tried to help Jewish and non-Jewish people. I would like to ask you a question. If you, during your research, read anything about non-Jewish people working for joint in Shanghai.
Oh, I left out something. No, there's something very interesting that about non-Jewish people working for joint in Shanghai. One of the, well, first of all, Shanghai, I'm sorry, JDC sent very few people in. Before the war, there was Manny and Laura. They both happened to be Jewish. And after the war, the three directors were all Jewish. And then they brought in, there was the social worker and her husband. They happened to be Jewish. But JDC itself, when Jordan took over, had 300 or 400 people working for them. Almost all of them came from the refugee community. Among them were non-Jews. For an example, and I really can't recall his name at the moment, the Director General, the #1 administrative head working under Jordan, was a non-Jew. Now, within the, what was the issue? Oh, there was an issue of kosher food. Someone complained. Some religious Jews complained. They wanted everything in the Haima to be kosher. They wanted Sabbath to be, they wanted Sabbath to be observed. And there were some complaints about non-Jews working for JDC. Oh, in other words, non-Jews working for JDC and non-Jews getting aid. So New York, Manny, I think, was in charge at the time, wrote to New York, what do I do? So New York came down with a policy and said, look, our policy is we don't distinguish between Jewish and non-Jewish refugees. There's a crisis, we're aiding those people in crisis. Our policy is we then approach non-Jewish groups, and they did in the United States, a Catholic agency and a Protestant agency, and we tell them, we have non-Jewish refugees we're taking care of. Do you want to help? So that they do, but they don't cut anyone's aid, etc. Now, they also made the statement, which I found interesting. Our policy is in senior positions. This is, remember, this is 1946, 47. In senior positions, we don't usually hire non-Jewish persons. However, in the case of this particular person working in Shanghai, who is not Jewish, if there are extenuating circumstances, meaning there's no one qualified to replace him, he should stay in his position. The other thing they said was, we're not going to force observance of Sabbath. If people want to observe it, they'll observe it. The other issue came up was also over kosher food. So they decided they wanted to have kosher food in the kitchens. And that was more expensive. That was a problem. It cost a lot of money. But they decided to have it because they wanted everyone to feel comfortable, etc. But when it came to the old age home, it was, the local JDC decided we're not going to serve kosher food. It's too expensive. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yes. Yes. So it means that actually that they did not distinguish to some extent, right? Yeah. So yes. All right. Other question concerns information about the situation of the restricted area or restricted zone, as it was called by the Japanese, shortly after the end of war. So according to some researchers, in August of, especially late August 1945 and September, this zone, this restricted zone, was not open. There were still refugees kept inside. They could not leave without special permission. So my question is, if joint work, joint activities were somehow changed during that period of time.
If joint what? I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Oh yes, if joint activities got changed during that time, during this 1.5 months.
Okay, no, okay. One thing, there was tremendous confusion at the end, because right at the end, I forget the exact date, there was a bombing by the American Air Force nearby, which several refugees were killed. Many refugees were wounded, and many of the Chinese neighbors were wounded. So there was some talk about how when the doctors dealt with patients, they didn't distinguish between the Chinese and the European. Everyone was taken care of, etc. There was a tremendous sense of the harmony of the victims. Now, I'm not an expert. I just don't know the exact dates, but one of the problems with when the war ended and when they ended the camp and when the Japanese fled, I'm not up to date on the exact dates. But the point is this: JDC through August was funding relief in that restricted area. There were various committees that had been set up. The committees cooperated with the Japanese authorities, etc. They provided food, they provided housing, they provided medical care, and other things like that. Now, and at a certain point, all of a sudden, everything ended. Now, as soon as everything ended, around that time, just when that time, Manny shows up. He comes out of the prison camp, and he comes back, and he takes over. He takes over. When he takes over, he works with the committees. But my point about the enclosed area, and I was just in a conference, a video conference, with several Chinese scholars. So one scholar who I argued with, and I didn't mean to argue with him, he made the comment that he referred to concentration camps. Okay, in other words, he used the term Japanese internment camps. Now, the Japanese interned Jews, not the refugees, but interned the veteran Jew, we call them veteran Jewish settlers in Shanghai. The Russians were not interned because the Russians had Russia and Japan had a treaty up until a certain date. They had an agreement. But the Sfardim, some were interned. Those Iraqi Sfardim that had British citizenship were interned as resident aliens or enemy aliens. Those that had Baghdadi, Iraqi citizenship were not. Okay, so you have most of the Iraqis go to internment camps run by the Japanese. So this Chinese professor refers to these are concentration camps, Gestapo. Okay, but in some of these camps, and I was reading some memoirs, some of these Iraqi Jews where we talk about the fact that they wanted kosher food. So they go to the commandant and they say, we want kosher food. So he says, what do you mean kosher food? What is kosher food? They negotiate, etc. So in one particular camp, or maybe more than one camp, they bring in fresh vegetables. They're allowed to cook in a separate kitchen, etc. I mean, that's an internment camp run by the Japanese. Now, that's not to say there weren't horrible things that happened and there wasn't torturing, etc. In various prisons, clearly there was. I mean, the point is, if one wants to make an analogy, the point that I would make, if one wants to make an analogy to Jews living under Germans in Nazi Europe, to Shanghai, then the analogy should be to the Chinese under the Japanese, not the Jews under the Japanese. That's all.
Yes, the Japanese seem to have a very special policy towards Jews from the 1930s through to the beginning of 1940s. And even when they established this restricted zone in 1943, they did not use the word ghetto. They just used the restricted area, actually. That was interesting, and the conditions, as far as I know, the conditions of living were very poor there. The sanitation was poor, yes, it was, but still it was much better and easier to survive than, for example, in some death camps in Europe. So that's a huge distinction. Next question I have. Yes, you mentioned Sfardim, the Baghdadi community. When you were researching the documents, did you encounter any documents stating that the Baghdadi community were kind of reluctant to agree to the influx of new refugees? They thought that there were too many refugees in Shanghai already.
What I have to admit as a scholar, when I did my research a couple of years ago, I've only been doing this for like 3 or 4 years, and I was actually helped by the virus, mainly because I got access for the first time through the internet to the archives of the JDC, which made work much, much easier. But when I started writing up my material, I decided to look at the period 45 on rather than 37 on, although I read all that material from 37 on. So I haven't looked at it in the same detail that I have other things. Now, the issue was, it's really the British. It's the British, Americans, and Japanese in these two communities, these two foreign entities within Shanghai. They're the ones that really set policy on immigration. And they didn't want many more. They were concerned about the economy. These groups were concerned about the economy and the ability of the economy to absorb more people. There were also, I don't know, up to 1 million Chinese refugees running around the city, dying in the streets, etc. Now, I just don't, so I really can't answer the question, but there was some concern about amongst the Jews in Shanghai, there might have been some I'm trying to remember stuff. There might have been some antagonism, resentment, or conflict of interest between the poor or the working class, because Jews might compete for the same types of jobs. Jews were willing to do almost anything, at least some of them when they came. I don't think that they were concerned about. I really can't answer that question authoritatively, so I'd rather not. I'm not trying to avoid it. I just don't. I don't think I can treat it fairly with expertise.
Because in David Kranzer's book, it is mentioned only just a short line that they tried to influence the council of the settlement not to allow more.
That's a real possibility, mainly because a lot of the support, the welfare services that were being provided to the refugees were being provided by this Baghdadi community. They had other priorities. Now, one of the other priorities that one should keep in mind, many of them were British citizens. Yes. Britain was in the war already. And when it came, there were various types of campaigns in Shanghai to raise money for the British war effort. They competed with that. Now, one of the things that's also interesting is with JDC, when JDC went into aiding the Jews in Baghdad, I'm sorry, you'll have to edit that out. When JDC started supporting the Jews in Shanghai, there was also money raised by Cairo, very limited, the Cairo Jewish community, and in London. There was an organization of something for German refugees, I forget the exact name, but it was based in London. It was London Jewry. They were raising money for Shanghai. So often JDC went into something in Shanghai, we'll give 50%, the English will give 50%. Once the war started in Europe, England stopped. The English Jewish community, we can't. We have our own war effort here. We can't do it. JDC had to do it alone.
Yes. All right. I asked a question about Sephardim, but I have a question concerning Ashkenazi group, especially Russian Jews, because you mentioned that, as far as I remember, in 1947 and 48, they were to start administering the joint things in Shanghai, and until 45, some Ashkenazi distribution groups were considered to be kind of bribed and not giving help equally to everyone. And was there any concern in joint that that the Ashkenazi group could somehow go back to these war?
Okay, you might have done more research on this subject than I did, but the one thing that was interesting is that the wealthy Baghdadis, if they were British citizens, they either got some of their money out of the country or their funds were frozen by the Japanese. So that means they weren't giving once the war started. Most of them were interned. Some of them were not interned, those that had Iraqi citizenship. Now, what the Japanese did was, when they set up the closed community in Hankou, with the barbed wire, etc., the Russians, they went to the Russian community and they said, "You're going to have to help us." So the Russians coordinated bringing in the Jews from the French Quarter and the international community as well to move them. The Russians all helped that. The Russians provided sort of a civilian guard unit. And the Russians cooperated with the Japanese. I mean, they had no choice, but they weren't interned, but they cooperated with them. And also the Russians provided a degree of aid for the Jewish refugees during World War II. They gave various types of aid. Now, to the best of my knowledge, the documents that I've seen, there wasn't a question of they're helping some and not others. Before the war, the Russians tended to favor those Jews from Poland. They tended to favor the Eastern Europeans.
Yes.
And they tended to be they didn't want anything to do with the Germans. But now, so by the time you get to late 48, when you get to 48 and the communists are approaching, they come in May of 49, and Glassgold, who was now running JDC, very much, he sets up a committee. And they managed to bring in at least one of the senior people in this new committee is going to be from the Sephardi, the Baghdadi community, or Sephardi community, but most of them are Russians. And he sets up this committee, and the committee takes over, and they still get some JDC funding. And they handle the community until the end. But by this time, everyone is leaving, including the Russian community as well.
Thank you. So maybe one more question, last question concerning immigration and the destinations where these refugees wanted to go to. Because shortly after the war, they had some imagination they would like to go, but slightly they changed the destinations they would like to go because of the situation, because of the limits, because of the quotas. But I would like to ask you a question about the Palestine. How did they go there? If Joint helped them, and do you have maybe any information what happened next? To especially you mentioned the group of elderly and sick people, how their life was later.
What happened was, once Israel became independent, that made it a lot easier. Now, sometime in 48, 47, 48, or it had to be in 48, Israel sent the consul from New York to give out, he was supposed to give out up to 7,000 visas to come to Israel. What was interesting, and they were going to give them out in Shanghai and all over China. A lot of the Jews in Harbin tended to be Zionistly enclosed. Now, IRO, the International Refugee Organization, provided two ships, which took 2 ships, and there was 3 ships in the beginning that took almost, 1,500, close to 2,000 people in 48 to Palestine, to Israel, by way of by way of the, I'm sorry, by way of the South Africa, South Africa, around Africa, etc. And then now the IRO in the beginning didn't want to fund. It was basically a lot of people from Great Britain. They didn't want to fund travel to Israel. Why? Because they argued it was a war zone. So but they eventually agreed. They agreed to provide transportation and to fund. They provided $300, etc. They wouldn't allow any soldiers on the boat. That was anyone belonging to a military force could not be a passenger on the boat. Then they started flying people in by way of India. Again, the IRO funded it. JDC organized it. JDC, along with the Jewish Agency, organized it. So you had JDC, the IRO funding the travel to Israel. And after 48, that became, once the United States was ruled out and someone that didn't want to stay in China and they couldn't get into Australia, if you didn't want to go back to Europe, you went to Israel. So the numbers went way up. But I mean, one thing that I think one has to keep in mind, it was very difficult before 48 to get to Israel, even if you wanted to go. So why not go to some other place? Because there wasn't transportation. The British weren't allowing people in. They were restricting, etc. So it changes with time.
Fortunately.
Yeah.
Yes, Professor, thank you very much. I had a great pleasure to listen to your talk and ask you some questions. So thank you so much. And I hope to listen to you once more in the future, to see you and to listen what you found more interesting in the documents. So.
Okay, thank you very, very much. And thanks to Joanna as well. And the other Joanna.
Thank you.